What binds a man more strongly, blood or desire? What shadows take root when power dares to blur the lines of love, loyalty, and sin? And what happens when a forbidden affection festers in the heart of a household already built upon cruelty and silence? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the hidden stories of vengeance, betrayal, and fate buried deep in America's haunted past. The year was 1852. Virginia's plantations rolled out like endless waves of green, their fields heavy with tobacco and whispers of misery. The air itself seemed soaked with sweat, soil, and sorrow. In the great house of Colonel William Ashford, silence reigned not from peace but from command. His was a household of rigid order, where footsteps dared not echo too loudly and even laughter seemed rationed. The colonel was a man both respected and feared. His presence was broad-shouldered, his voice sharp as a whip, his authority unquestioned. Yet beneath the steel of his posture, there lived a weakness hidden from most eyes, a longing that dared not be named. For within his own household labored a young maid, Clara, whose quiet presence seemed to unsettle the very foundations of his discipline. Clara was no ordinary figure in the estate. Her silence carried weight, her glance carried fire, and her work was precise, as though each movement was both survival and defiance. She spoke little, for words could often become chains, but her silence was eloquent. In her eyes lingered storms, and the colonel, against all reason, against his own pride, found himself drawn to that storm as though it were the only honest thing he had ever seen. His wife, Margaret Ashford, embodied the cold grandeur of Virginia's elite. She was a woman bred to command dinners, to oversee parlors, to ensure her station remained untarnished. But love had long since fled their union. Their marriage was a ceremony of appearances, a hollow performance for society's gaze. Margaret sensed her husband's wandering silence, though she did not yet name its cause. Her suspicion was a seed, small but deadly, waiting for the right soil to take root. In the dim evenings, when candles guttered and the estate's halls carried more shadow than light, the colonel would linger longer than necessary where Clara worked. His gaze followed her hands as they scrubbed, folded, mended. Each thread she touched seemed to pull tighter on something he could not control. One night, as a storm raged outside and thunder clawed across the sky, the colonel found himself standing at the kitchen's threshold. Clara was there, her figure haloed by the glow of the fire, her face calm, her hands busy with needle and cloth. For a long moment he watched. And when she lifted her eyes to meet his, time itself seemed to fracture. Neither spoke. The silence between them was heavier than words, sharper than confession. But the house was not blind. Servants whispered in corners. Overseers exchanged knowing looks. Even the walls seemed to hum with suspicion. Desire, once ignited, cannot be hidden for long, especially not in a world where sin and scandal thrive like weeds. Margaret Ashford began to notice the late hours her husband kept. She watched the strange softness in his eyes when Clara entered a room. She felt the absence of his affection, an absence that had once merely been neglect but now carried the sting of betrayal. Jealousy is a fire that burns colder at first, but it always seeks fuel, and soon Margaret would find hers. But for now, the house remained still, outwardly obedient. Clara continued her tasks with a calm that belied the storm around her. The colonel's eyes continued to wander where they should not. And in the silence between them, something dangerous was being born. Outside, the land itself seemed to reflect their secret. The Virginia skies grew heavy with summer storms, and the river by the estate swelled with unspoken currents. Even the birds that circled above seemed restless, their cries sharp against the dusk. Nature, too, seemed to whisper. Something was coming. In the great house, shadows stretched longer across the walls, and whispers crawled through the air like smoke. The first cracks in the Ashford estate's fragile order had begun to show, though no one yet dared to speak them aloud. And so the question lingered, unspoken but suffocating. How long could such forbidden fire burn before it consumed everything it touched? The answer was already taking shape in the silence, waiting to break. The summer of 1852 did not pass quietly. Heat pressed down on the Ashford estate until the very walls of the house seemed to sweat. Tempers sharpened, patience wore thin, and in the midst of it all, the Colonel's secret grew heavier with every stolen glance. Clara carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew her silence was her only weapon. She did not return the Colonel's advances, not in word nor in touch. But her refusal did not lessen his obsession, it deepened it. Each day he found new excuses to summon her. A mended coat, a late meal, candle relit. To others these seemed trivial, but to Margaret Ashford, they were sirens in the dark. Margaret had been raised in a world where reputation was everything. To lose her husband's loyalty was painful enough. To lose it to a maid, unthinkable. Her fury became a quiet storm. She did not confront William directly. Instead she watched, she listened, she plotted. In the household, whispers began to coil like snakes. Overseers noted how often Clara was kept inside the great house, away from the fields. Other servants wondered why the Colonel's eyes lingered so long in the kitchen. They dared not say too much, but rumors have a way of traveling farther than footsteps. One evening, during a grand supper with neighboring landowners, Margaret's patience snapped. As the table gleamed with silverware and wine shimmered in crystal, her eyes followed Clara, who moved silently, pouring glasses, serving meat, refilling plates. Margaret's husband, for all his effort to appear distant, allowed a moment of softness to slip, his gaze lingering too long on the maid's hands as she set down his wine. Margaret's smile never broke. Her laughter chimed politely with the guests. But behind her eyes, something darker stirred. That night, when the guests had departed and the house was draped in silence, she retired to her chambers, her thoughts clawing at her. She knew the truth now, not just suspicion but certainty. In the days that followed, Margaret's demeanor shifted. She became sharper, her commands colder. She found excuses to belittle Clara in front of others, to remind her of her place. Yet the Colonel, instead of rebuking his wife, grew more protective of the maid. He ordered tasks lightened, ensured Clara worked within the house rather than the fields, and even dismissed harsh reprimands Margaret tried to inflict. Each act of protection was a blade to his wife's pride. But Clara was not blind to the danger around her. She knew the mistress's eyes followed her everywhere. She knew every kindness from the Colonel only deepened the target on her back. In the still hours of the night she prayed, not for rescue, not for escape, but for strength. Strength to endure. Strength to survive whatever storm was coming. And it was coming. One afternoon, Margaret summoned Clara to her chambers. The air was heavy with perfume, the curtains drawn tight, the light dim. Margaret sat at her vanity, brushing her hair with long, deliberate strokes. Clara stood silently at the door, waiting. "Do you know your place in this house?" Margaret's voice was calm, almost sweet. Clara lowered her eyes and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "And yet," Margaret continued, her brush pausing mid-stroke, "my husband seems to think otherwise. Tell me, Clara, do you enjoy the attention he gives you?" The question was a trap, one Clara knew better than to answer. Silence was her shield. But Margaret's lips curled into a bitter smile at the lack of response. "You think you're clever. You think your quiet makes you innocent. But I see you. And I will not allow a servant girl to shame me in my own home." Clara bowed her head, whispered, "I meant no disrespect, ma'am." "Disrespect?" Margaret hissed, rising to her feet. "You've already given me something far worse than disrespect. You've given me humiliation." The tension in that room was a prelude to tragedy. Clara left with her heart pounding, knowing the mistress's fury was not just jealousy, it was a promise of vengeance. Meanwhile, the Colonel, blind to the storm building within his own home, continued his dangerous path. He sought Clara out more openly, speaking to her with an intimacy that others noticed. He believed his authority shielded him. He believed his wife's silence was mere discontent, not deadly resolve. He was wrong. By late summer, The Ashford estate had become a battlefield of unspoken war. Margaret sharpened her words like daggers. Clara braced herself against each passing day. Her steps measured, her breath steady. And the Colonel drifted further into obsession, blind to the cracks spreading beneath his feet. One night, when the moon was thin and the estate lay hushed, Margaret stood at the window of her chamber, watching the fields ripple in silver light. Her reflection stared back at her, cold, hollow, furious. She whispered to herself, "If he loves her more than his wife, then let him lose them both." And with those words, the seeds of ruin were sown. The story was no longer about a forbidden affection. It had become a story of vengeance waiting to strike, of silence breaking into screams, of love twisting into a noose. The Colonel, Clara, and Margaret were already prisoners of the fate they themselves had woven. And soon one single irreversible act, would turn longing into loss, suspicion into blood, and silence into the kind of story history does not forget.